Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. We live in an age where crisis is no longer an interruption. It is the system itself. From global pandemics and financial collapses to climate catastrophes and digital surveillance, the logic of emergency now dictates the way power is exercised, expanded, and rarely relinquished. But what happens when governments and corporations no longer seek to solve crises, but to sustain them? When instability is not an obstacle to governance, but its very foundation? Today's episode unpacks the transformation of crisis from an event to a governing principle, revealing how fear, surveillance, and biopolitical control have reshaped the modern state, not as a protector of rights, but as a manager of permanent instability. Drawing on the insights of Michel Foucault's theory of biopolitics, Giorgio Agamben's concept of the state of exception, and Naomi Klein's analysis of disaster capitalism, we explore how emergency powers, once thought to be temporary, have become the default condition of political life. To explore more about the concepts and thinkers discussed, including Foucault's biopolitics, Agamben's state of exception, and Klein's disaster capitalism, please go to the description where you'll find a link to the episode webpage, which includes additional reading, resources, and recommendations. We no longer live in an era of crises. We live in an era where crisis is governance itself. The difference is not just semantic, but existential. Once emergencies were moments of rupture, demanding swift action before a return to normalcy. Now they are the foundation upon which power is exercised and sustained. Terrorism, financial collapse, climate catastrophe, and pandemics no longer merely disrupt political life. They define it. The logic of the temporary has given way to the permanence of emergency, and in this shift, the very nature of governance has changed. Consider the last 2 decades. The attacks of September 11, 2001 ushered in the global war on terror, justifying mass surveillance, indefinite detention, and a sweeping expansion of executive power. The 2008 financial crisis led to bailouts that protected the wealthy while imposing austerity on the public. The COVID-19 pandemic saw the rapid deployment of digital health tracking, movement restrictions, and an acceleration of the state's ability to monitor and control individuals. Each of these moments was framed as an exceptional response to an urgent threat, yet their effects have lingered, mutating into new norms that shape daily life. Surveillance laws remain, financial power is more concentrated than ever, and digital tracking has become routine. In every case, the crisis did not end, it was absorbed into governance itself. Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics provides a crucial framework for understanding this transformation. Modern power does not merely govern through law or coercion, but through the management of life itself, regulating populations under the guise of security and welfare. When governments invoke emergency powers, they expand their reach into everyday existence, dictating where people go, what they consume, how they interact. Giorgio Agamben takes this further with his theory of the state of exception, in which legal norms are suspended under emergency rule. Yet history shows that what begins as an exception frequently becomes the rule. Power, once expanded, is rarely relinquished. This is not merely a question of state overreach. Capitalism, too, has adapted to the era of perpetual crisis, not by seeking stability, but by profiting from instability. Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism explains how economic and corporate elites exploit emergencies to push through policies that consolidate wealth and entrench inequality. Whether through privatized war zones, financial speculation on economic collapse, or the monetization of climate disaster, crisis has become a profitable condition, one that elites have no incentive to resolve. The stakes could not be higher. If governance by crisis continues unchecked, democracy itself may be at risk. When fear becomes the dominant political emotion, when surveillance becomes routine, and when emergency rule becomes indistinguishable from ordinary governance, what remains of the social contract? How do we ensure that crisis management serves the public good rather than elite interests? If crisis is now the default condition of political life, then the most urgent question is not how to prevent the next emergency, but how to reclaim democracy from the grip of perpetual exception. Fear has always been a tool of governance, but in the modern era it has evolved from a tactic into an operating principle. No longer a temporary mechanism to mobilize citizens in times of war or instability, fear has become the bedrock upon which political legitimacy is built. A population that is afraid of terrorism, of economic collapse, of pandemics, of climate catastrophe is a population more willing to accept extraordinary measures in the name of security. This is the new social contract, not based on rights and responsibilities, but on perpetual anxiety and the promise of protection. Nowhere is this clearer than in the post-9/11 world. The attacks on the Twin Towers did not justify a temporary military response. They rewrote the relationship between citizens and the state. The Patriot Act, warrantless wiretapping, indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay. Each of these measures was framed as an emergency necessity, yet decades later they remain in place. The security state once built does not dismantle itself. A similar logic emerged with the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns, digital contact tracing, emergency powers, all justified as immediate responses to a health crisis, have left behind an infrastructure of surveillance and control that persists long after the initial threat has receded. Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics helps illuminate this shift. Modern governance is no longer just about ruling territories. It is about managing populations. Health, security, behavior all become sites of political intervention. The result is a subtle but profound transformation. The state no longer simply responds to crises. It reorganizes society around them. The individual's role in this system is no longer that of a political actor, but a subject to be monitored, regulated, and protected. In this framework, citizenship is not a set of rights, but a condition of compliance. Yet fear-based governance is not simply imposed from above. It is internalized. People accept and even demand measures that restrict their freedoms in exchange for perceived safety. This is the paradox of modern democracy. Citizens voluntarily cede their rights, believing that each new crisis requires an exceptional response. The war on terror saw the public accept unprecedented surveillance. The financial crisis saw the acceptance of austerity as unavoidable. The pandemic saw widespread compliance with movement restrictions and digital tracking. At each stage, fear dictated policy and policy became permanence. But are these measures always unjustified? The challenge is that real threats exist. Terrorism, economic collapse, pandemics, and climate disasters are not fabrications. The question is not whether governments should act in times of crisis, but whether the normalization of emergency powers erodes the very freedoms they claim to protect. If fear remains the dominant organizing principle of governance, what space remains for democratic deliberation? More dangerously, what happens when those in power recognize that fear is the most effective means of maintaining control? If the social contract is now dictated by crisis management, then democracy risks becoming a performance, a ritualized affirmation of power, rather than a system in which the people genuinely shape their political destiny. Surveillance has become the defining condition of modern life. Once justified as an extraordinary measure in times of war or crisis, it is now woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Governments and corporations monitor, track, and predict behavior under the pretense of security, convenience, and efficiency. The result is a world in which the very notion of privacy is dissolving, not through overt repression, but through a slow, steady normalization of total visibility. The post-9/11 era marked the first great expansion of mass surveillance in the digital age. The US National Security Agency, NSA, through programs like PRISM and X-Keyscore, collected vast amounts of private data under the justification of preventing terrorism. Edward Snowden's 2013 revelations exposed the sheer scale of state surveillance, yet little changed. Governments defended these programs as necessary safeguards, and the public, conditioned by fear, largely accepted them. What was once considered an unacceptable intrusion became an inescapable reality. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic, which further entrenched surveillance as a public health necessity. Contact tracing apps, biometric scanning, and digital health passports were introduced as emergency measures, but many of these technologies remain. The pandemic provided a blueprint for a new kind of control, one where the state monitors not just movement or communication, but biological status itself. The boundary between public health and political control is now dangerously blurred. Michel Foucault's theory of disciplinary power helps explain this shift. Surveillance is not just about watching, it is about shaping behavior. When people know they are being monitored, they modify their actions, often without explicit coercion. This is the genius of modern control. It does not need to be enforced through brute force. It is internalized. The panopticon, once a metaphor for prison architecture, is now the structure of society itself. But today's surveillance is not merely a function of the state. It is also the backbone of the digital economy. Shoshana Zuboff's concept of surveillance capitalism describes how tech corporations profit from extracting and monetizing personal data. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon operate vast surveillance networks under the guise of personalization and user convenience. The digital economy thrives on predictive analytics, knowing what people will do before they do it. And governments, rather than resisting corporate data extraction, increasingly rely on it for governance. The most insidious feature of this new system is that participation is not forced, it is voluntary. People give up their privacy for access to digital services, loyalty programs, smart home devices, and social networks. In exchange for convenience, they surrender control over their personal data. This is the paradox of modern surveillance. It does not require an authoritarian state, it only requires willing subjects. Where does this leave democracy? If surveillance conditions behavior, if digital platforms manipulate public discourse, and if crisis governance justifies constant monitoring, then the very idea of political autonomy is under threat. A society that is always watched is a society that cannot be free. The question is no longer whether we can resist surveillance, it is whether we have already accepted it as the price of living in the modern world. The state of exception has become the rule. Emergency powers, once invoked only in times of extraordinary crisis, are now a permanent feature of governance. From counterterrorism laws to pandemic restrictions, governments have acquired the ability to bypass normal democratic procedures whenever they deem it necessary. The justification is always the same: security, stability, the protection of public welfare. But the result is the same as well: an erosion of democratic accountability and the expansion of unchecked power. Giorgio Agamben provides a crucial framework for understanding this transformation. In his theory of the state of exception, Agamben argues that governments, when faced with emergencies, suspend legal norms and place themselves beyond the rule of law. This is not merely an abuse of power, it is a reconfiguration of power itself. The emergency, rather than being a temporary deviation from normal governance, becomes the foundation upon which governance operates. In such a system, sovereignty is defined by the ability to declare an emergency and determine when the exception ends, if it ever does. Recent history provides ample evidence of how emergency powers are rarely relinquished. The United States Authorization for Use of Military Force, AUMF, passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, has been used to justify military interventions and drone strikes for over 2 decades. France's state of emergency, declared after the 2015 terrorist attacks, was extended multiple times before being codified into ordinary law. Hong Kong's national security law, imposed under the guise of restoring order, has permanently reshaped political life by criminalizing dissent. The logic of crisis governance is self-reinforcing. Once emergency powers are invoked, they create the conditions that justify their continuation. Governments argue that the threat has not yet fully subsided, that new dangers have emerged, that stability cannot be risked. The longer emergency measures persist, the more they reshape political norms. What was once unthinkable, indefinite detention without trial, warrantless surveillance, curfews, restrictions on movement, becomes accepted as necessary, even inevitable. Carl Schmitt's theory of sovereignty is particularly relevant here. For Schmitt, the sovereign is not the entity that follows the law, but the one who decides when the law no longer applies. In modern governance, this means that power is increasingly concentrated in the executive, while legislative and judicial oversight are weakened. Democratic deliberation is sidelined in favor of executive orders, emergency decrees, and rule by technocratic decision-making. The longer this persists, the more democracy becomes a performance rather than a reality. The question we must confront is whether the state of exception can ever be undone. If emergency powers have become the default mechanism of governance, what prevents their indefinite continuation? Legal frameworks designed to limit such powers, sunset clauses, judicial oversight, parliamentary approval, have proven largely ineffective. The burden of proof has shifted. Rather than governments needing to justify why emergency powers should continue, the public must now prove why they should end. If crisis is the new normal, then democracy itself risks becoming little more than a ceremonial relic, invoked in theory but abandoned in practice. Capitalism has not only adapted to crisis, it has learned to thrive on it. The logic of disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein describes it, is simple. In moments of crisis, when societies are too shocked or destabilized to resist, radical economic transformations are pushed through. The result is not just the survival of capitalism in the face of crisis, but its deepening reliance on it. Governments, corporations, and financial institutions have discovered that instability is not a threat to be managed, it is an opportunity to be exploited. The 2008 financial crisis offers a clear example. It was a crisis of capitalism's own making, triggered by reckless financial speculation and deregulation. Yet when the system collapsed, the response was not reform but consolidation. Governments bailed out banks, not citizens. Financial institutions received trillions in state support, while millions of ordinary people lost their homes, savings, and jobs. The crisis, rather than leading to greater economic accountability, entrenched the power of financial elites. The lesson was clear. Economic instability does not threaten the ruling class, it strengthens it. A similar pattern emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. While small businesses collapsed, major corporations, particularly in technology, pharmaceuticals, and logistics, saw unprecedented profits. Amazon, Google, and Facebook expanded their market dominance, while vaccine patents ensured that pharmaceutical giants controlled the global distribution of life-saving medicine. Emergency government spending, ostensibly meant to support struggling populations, often ended up enriching the very industries that benefited from the crisis. In this model, crisis governance and corporate power become indistinguishable. Governments act not to prevent instability, but to redistribute its effects, ensuring that wealth flows upward while risk is pushed downward. Climate change provides perhaps the most extreme example of capitalism's reliance on crisis. Rather than leading to systemic changes that could mitigate ecological collapse, climate disasters are now fueling new markets. Carbon credits, geoengineering technologies, and disaster recovery industries all demonstrate how capitalism has transformed existential risk into a financial instrument. Investment firms are already betting on which cities will become uninhabitable and which resources will become scarce, treating catastrophe as a predictable and profitable market trend. Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism helps explain why no alternative seems to emerge. Fisher argues that neoliberal capitalism has positioned itself as the only viable system, even in the face of its obvious failures. Crisis no longer threatens the system because the system has absorbed crisis into its logic. The response to every emergency, whether financial, medical, or ecological, is the same: more privatization, more consolidation, more government intervention on behalf of markets rather than people. If crisis governance is a political mechanism, disaster capitalism is its economic counterpart. Together, they ensure that each new catastrophe, whether a pandemic, financial meltdown, or climate disaster, leaves the status quo more entrenched than before. This raises an urgent question. If crisis has become the engine of capitalism rather than its failure, then what incentive exists to prevent future crises at all? If anything, the market has made it clear stability is not profitable. Catastrophe is. The management of crisis is no longer just about controlling external threats. It is about governing life itself. In the modern state, power extends beyond laws and institutions to the biological, psychological, and behavioral regulation of individuals. This is the logic of biopolitics, as Michel Foucault describes it. The transformation of governance from ruling over subjects to administering bodies, populations, and health. In a world where crises, whether pandemics, financial meltdowns, or ecological disasters, are continuous, the state increasingly operates not as a guarantor of rights, but as a manager of life. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed the full extent of this transformation. Governments worldwide assumed unprecedented control over the movement, interactions, and behaviours of their populations. Digital health passports, contact tracing, and restrictions on assembly were justified as necessary measures to contain the virus. Yet these policies also demonstrated the ease with which states can impose new forms of social control when framed as matters of public health and security. The crisis created a new social contract, compliance in exchange for safety. But this process did not begin with COVID-19. Immigration policies, for example, have long relied on biopolitical mechanisms, requiring biometric data, medical screenings, and genetic testing to determine who is permitted to move across borders. Welfare systems, too, increasingly use algorithmic assessments to determine eligibility, regulating access to resources based on behavioral data. Even policing has adopted biopolitical dimensions, with predictive analytics and AI-driven surveillance categorizing individuals as potential threats before they have acted. Foucault's insight was that modern power does not operate through direct repression alone, but through the normalization of regulatory mechanisms. When control is framed as a matter of public welfare, it becomes more difficult to resist. The war on terror justified mass surveillance in the name of security. The financial crisis justified austerity in the name of economic stability. The pandemic justified behavioral tracking in the name of public health. Each time, new forms of governance were introduced that did not disappear when the immediate crisis ended. The deeper question is whether democracy can survive in a system where life itself is subjected to constant regulation. The social contract of liberal democracy was based on the idea that governments rule with the consent of the governed. But if governance is increasingly about controlling health, behaviour, and movement under the guise of crisis response, then the role of the citizen shifts. People are no longer political actors, they are subjects to be managed. The challenge is that many accept this shift, believing that biopolitical control is a necessary trade-off for stability. If crisis governance has made biopolitical intervention the norm, then what limits remain? What happens when climate change, economic instability, or new pandemics demand even greater state control? The risk is that governance by emergency becomes governance by administration, where the political disappears entirely and all that remains is management of populations, risks, and behaviours. If this is the new reality, then the question is no longer how we protect democracy in moments of crisis, but whether democracy, in any meaningful sense, can exist at all. If crisis governance is here to stay, then how can it be resisted? How can democracy reassert itself when every emergency strengthens the mechanisms of control? The challenge is not just that governments accumulate power in times of crisis, it is that these powers become self-perpetuating, reinforcing a system in which governance is no longer about representation, but about the management of instability. To resist this, it is not enough to critique the expansion of state control. We must also rethink the conditions under which emergency measures are justified and demand mechanisms that prevent their indefinite extension. History provides examples of moments when societies have successfully challenged the normalization of emergency rule. After World War II, legal frameworks like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were designed to prevent the unchecked use of state power that had enabled totalitarianism. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, public outcry forced the US government to limit executive war powers through the War Powers Act. Even after 9/11, some of the most extreme counterterrorism measures, such indefinite detention without trial, faced legal and political challenges. But in each of these cases, resistance required sustained public engagement, legal activism, and political pressure. The rollback of emergency governance does not happen automatically, it must be demanded. One of the most crucial reforms needed is the imposition of strict sunset clauses on emergency powers. Governments should not be allowed to extend crisis measures indefinitely without legislative oversight and clear justification. Sunset clauses ensure that emergency laws expire unless actively renewed, shifting the burden of proof back onto the state. But as history shows, sunset clauses alone are often inadequate. Many post-9/11 security measures were initially temporary, yet became permanent through quiet legislative extensions. This means that public pressure and transparency must accompany legal safeguards. Another necessary reform is the establishment of independent oversight mechanisms to scrutinize government actions taken under emergency powers. Judicial and parliamentary review processes should not be bypassed in the name of crisis response. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, and civil society organizations must play a role in exposing the ways in which crisis governance is used to consolidate power. The challenge is that surveillance states, by their very nature, make dissent more difficult. By tracking communications, criminalizing leaks, and controlling digital spaces, governments make it harder for resistance movements to organize. Beyond institutional safeguards, there must also be a cultural shift in how crises are understood. Fear-driven governance thrives when the public accepts that extraordinary measures are always necessary. This means challenging the narrative that security requires the surrender of freedoms. It means questioning the assumption that crises justify top-down control rather than democratic deliberation. It means resisting the framing of emergency governance as an inevitable response to modern threats. The most dangerous aspect of perpetual crisis governance is that it creates a world in which people no longer expect to live without emergency rule. It normalizes the suspension of democracy under the pretense of necessity. But this is not inevitable. Resistance begins with recognizing that crisis should be a moment for democratic renewal, not authoritarian entrenchment. The question is whether societies will demand that renewal, or whether they will continue to accept emergency as the only mode of political life. We stand at a crossroads. Crisis governance has become the defining feature of our time, reshaping the relationship between power and the people. Every emergency, whether a terrorist attack, a financial meltdown, a pandemic, or a climate disaster, has justified new expansions of state and corporate control. Surveillance has become routine, emergency laws have become permanent, and the logic of crisis management has displaced the principles of democratic governance. The result is a system in which power is no longer accountable to the public but justified through the perpetual invocation of danger. The question is not whether crises will continue to shape politics. This is inevitable. The question is whether we allow them to dictate the terms of our political existence. The stakes could not be higher. If emergency rule remains the default condition of governance, then democracy, in any meaningful sense, ceases to function. Elections may continue, parliaments may convene, and public debates may occur, but they take place within a framework where the most fundamental decisions on security, economics, health, and civil liberties are increasingly made outside democratic control. The danger is that this shift is subtle, happening not through the overt dismantling of democratic institutions, but through their gradual transformation into instruments of crisis management. The social contract, once based on political participation and accountability, is being rewritten as a system of compliance and surveillance. But this outcome is not inevitable. If crisis has become the foundation of governance, then the only way to reclaim democracy is to challenge the assumption that emergency rule is necessary, perpetual, and beyond contestation. This requires a new form of political engagement, one that does not simply react to each new crisis, but addresses the deeper structures that make crisis governance so difficult to undo. It requires legal frameworks that impose strict limits on emergency powers, ensuring they cannot be extended indefinitely. It requires a public discourse that resists fear-driven policymaking and demands transparency from those who wield crisis as a tool of power. Most importantly, it requires a collective refusal to accept crisis as the organizing principle of modern life. To do this, we must fundamentally rethink the nature of security. True security is not just the absence of external threats. It is the presence of rights, freedoms, and democratic accountability. A society that trades these away for a fleeting sense of stability risks finding itself permanently trapped in a state of controlled instability. The real danger is not terrorism, economic collapse, or pandemics. It is the willingness to accept emergency rule as the cost of survival. The future has not yet been decided. The structures of power that sustain crisis governance are strong, but they are not unchallengeable. The real choice is not between security and freedom, nor between stability and democracy. The real choice is between a world in which crisis is exploited to justify ever-expanding control, and a world in which crisis is confronted with, understood, and ultimately overcome in the name of democracy itself. The time to make that choice is now. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay read by me, Holly, your digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and recommendations, visit the episode webpage linked in the description. Until next time.